Here's your brief devotion for busy people from 1 Kings 8. 1 Kings 8 is the dedication of the temple. It's the culmination of so much Old Testament history that has happened so far. Mosaic promises, Abrahamic promises, but perhaps most of all, the promises of God to David. You remember, David wanted to build a house for the Lord. But what did God say? God said, you're not going to build me a house. Rather, I will build your house and your son will build the temple. And that's what we have right here. 1 Kings 8 follows chapters of descriptions on the construction of the temple, all this materials. It's very tedious. And the point throughout all of it is, this is so much greater than the tabernacle. The celebration in 1 Kings 8 is so much greater. The temple is so much bigger than the tabernacle. The materials are so much more rich, way more gold. It's like the tabernacle turned up to 11. And we get to 1 Kings 8 and this dedication. The ark is brought into the temple for the first time in 100 years, or brought back to the sacrificial system for the first time in 100 years. And all the house of Israel is here. And sacrifice upon sacrifice is offered. That's one emphasis you see is hundreds of thousands of sacrifices. At first it says more than can be counted, but later when they finally do decide to count, it's 142,000 sacrifices offered. And Solomon is here at the center of it all, officiating everything. He's almost like a new Adam in a sense. He's the one who asked for God the wisdom to discern between good and evil. It's very much Eden-like languages. And his home is even built into the temple complex. The Son of God is dwelling among the house of God. And at the pinnacle of it all, so to speak, is verse 10, when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. God has come. He's condescended to dwell among his people. He's come into the city of God to be with his people. But over all of this, maybe the biggest portion of this section is this prayer that Solomon prays. You'd think it would be all about the sacrifices or all about the ornateness of the celebration, and that's there. But Solomon has this massive prayer, and there's a few things that are interesting to take note of in this prayer. First is that Solomon recognizes God's presence can't be contained by this place. 8:27, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? God's glory is in the temple in a real way, but even more so, it cannot be contained by the temple. You also see the human sinfulness. You would think that you would see more a recognition of the sacrificial system. But over and over again, Solomon talks about how someone sins, and if they pray to this temple, that is, if they offer their prayers to God, he would listen and forgive. Most importantly, he's not listening from the temple. He's listening in heaven. Again, he's not contained by the temple. And hanging over like a shadow over Chapter 8 and chapter 9 is the potential for disobedience and punishment from God. There's a recognition in Solomon's prayers that Israel, they're going to sin. Verse 46, if they sin against you, for there was no one who does not sin, and you are angry with them, and give them to an enemy so that they are carried away captive to the land of the enemy, far off or near. We know the end of the story. We know this is going to happen. It's hanging over this passage. The shadow, just as this is a fulfillment of God's covenant promises, there is also a fulfillment of God's covenant curses. In 1 Kings 9, God's going to say this. But if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them and the house that I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight, and this house will become a heap of ruins. The glory of the house in its greatness of its downfall will be assigned to the nations of the judgment of God against the people of Israel. It's hanging over this passage. This is the high watermark of Solomon's reign, and yet in chapter 11, my Bible, it says Solomon turns from the Lord. The fact that God dwells among his people won't save them from judgment, because they can obey. And this is really the promise of the new covenant, that they need a new heart, that they need God's Spirit, and this is what they don't have. And as we go into the New Testament, the language of temple is transitioned from a place to a person and to a people. You hear of Jesus speaking of his body as the temple. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And when we think about the temple being not just in the New Testament a reference to Jesus, but a reference to his people. John 14:23, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. Paul picks up this idea in 1 Corinthians 3. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? In this passage, it's talked about how God placed his name on the temple. Revelation 3, the one who is victorious, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will they leave it. I will write on them the name of my God. In the New Testament, the place of God's dwelling goes from being a place, a physical location, the temple, to being his people. And while the celebration of the temple's dedication was a high point for Israel, the true glory of it was that God was dwelling with his people. And even now, God dwells with us. And that's not to diminish the glory of Solomon's temple. You see it was probably the high watermark of all these people's lives, a thing they would never forget. But it simply highlights that the latter glory is greater than the former. And that when we look at each other and when we think about ourselves, we aren't just looking at simple human beings, we're looking at the dwelling place of God among us. And how often do we think about that when we see our brothers and sisters? How often do we think about that when we think about ourselves and what that means for us? C.S. Lewis in The Weight of Glory wrote this: next to the blessed sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. If he is your Christian neighbor, he is holy in almost the same way. For in him also Christ, the glorifier and the glorified, glory himself, is truly hidden.